Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Joe Aniello, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about leadership. I recently wrote a book about leadership, the focus being to distinguish between leadership and management. And that's been quite an interesting evolution over the years. For many years, leadership and management were considered pretty much the same thing. My contention is they are, in fact, very different. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why that is so. For a lot of years, management and leadership have met with sociological definitions, demographic kind of stuff. You know, people are different in terms of their race or their religion or their ethnicity, their gender. Men are different than women, blue collar different than white collar, college educated versus non-college educated, income differences. And what I'm here to talk about is the fact that I think those differences are not really relevant anymore. Just like, a horse and buggy used to be our best transportation. That's not relevant anymore. And so one of the things I wanted to explain to you is why and how leadership has emerged from management in a different and separate way. It has not happened quickly, it has happened over time, and we're going to talk about the various processes in which leadership has developed to emerge from management. The first theory of leadership was what's called the great man theory. And this was really almost back during the days when people didn't have explanation for things. People have always tried to explain things in the best way possible, but they've been wrong a lot of the times, right? The sun, in fact, does not revolve around the earth. The earth is not, in fact, flat. But yet we explain things in terms of mythological reasons, right? There's a sun god and Neptune is the god of the sea. And these were kind of basic explanations of things. And to be honest with you, not to be critical of past generations, they all did the best they could, but they really didn't understand things. I mean, think about it. They would look at the sun and say the sun is round, and then they would look at the stars and they would think the stars were five-pointed objects, when in fact they were round. They didn't have the telescopes to necessarily look at them to see what shape they really were, so they made the best guess they can. And that's been true with pretty much everything in terms of man trying to explain things as good as they possibly can, given the knowledge and information that they had. So back in the early days, leaders were considered great men. Yes, there were some queens. There were a couple of women that were leaders. You all hear about, Queen Cleopatra and Queen Nefertiti, etc. But basically, it was called the great man theory. And people didn't understand why people were, in fact, leaders. They felt they were just born that way. And there was a mystical way that they explained why other people were following certain individuals. And so, in many ways, they couldn't really understand why this was so, and they didn't try to explain it other than the fact that he was born a leader. And so, one of the more modern questions are leaders born or made? Of course, the modern answer is yes, but the ancient answer was no. They are, in fact, born to be leaders. And many ways, leadership was kind of like art. People who were artists like Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo, they thought that the gods had visited these people and given them some special muse, and they were able to sculpt, or they were able to draw, or they were able to sing or compose symphonies. And in many ways, that's how they explained the great man leadership. This person was born to know where to go, and we're going to follow them, because we don't necessarily have any other choices. or we don't necessarily have any better ways to do that. Well, after, years and years of the great man theory, a new theory emerged that was more in the more modern times, the Renaissance age, etc. And this was called the trait theory. This theory explained that leaders had certain traits that made other people follow. In many ways, they were physical traits. They were traits that one was born with, but they weren't as mystical and mysterious as they were tangible. For example, tall people were naturally more drawn to leadership positions. We've all heard the expression, I look up to him, right? I look up to her. Well, that originated from the fact that people were taller. And so that gave them a trait that prepared them better for leadership. Also, thinness. Some people might cruelly describe overweight or fat people as somewhat lazy or undisciplined, right? We know there might be physiological reasons for that, but in any event, someone who was thin and athletic, muscular, they had the traits that seemed to be geared toward leadership. Something like a square jaw, round faces were not considered as leadership oriented. They might be pleasant to look at, but they weren't as leadership. Deeper voices, people who had a deep voice, they sounded more authoritative. Even if you think about modern day radio, there are certain people who have a good speaking voice audibly on a radio show or on a television show, and others who may sound high-pitched and squeaky, which doesn't lend itself toward wanting to listen to and follow. Another aspect, too, was full hair. People who had a full head of hair, whether it was a biblical reference left over from Samson or it was some other reason, somehow we don't think of a short, chubby, balding person with a round face as someone that we're going to want to follow. So back then, before we knew any more, it became a subject of physical traits. Who looks the part? Who is handsome and authoritative and strong and virile? And so those were the qualities that became necessary for physical traits. And of course, a lot of this corresponded to the study of philosophy. When we talk about the great man theory, we talk about people studying astronomy or physics or medicine. Those were the studies of sciences, but they weren't really studying behavioral sciences back then. It took the Renaissance for the kind of era of psychology to emerge. And they also studied what kind of traits that leaders had with regard to their own self-knowledge. Someone who was very knowledgeable about themselves was someone that we would want to listen to. In other words, if you could lead yourself and you had your own act together, then that might be a reason that I should listen to you. Listen to your advice, listen to your wisdom, listen to your knowledge, and kind of do what you recommend, okay? So they had to be wise, and wisdom starts with self-knowledge, right? I think it was Socrates who said, know thyself, okay? When I teach college classes, I a lot of times tell my students that the very first job they have in school is to know thyself before they have to know any of the subject matters. So that's an important self-knowledge, self-awareness, self-consciousness. Also, though, you want to be able to do that with honesty and integrity. You don't want to be someone that's trying to fool yourself, deceive yourself. You don't want to be someone who's delusional about yourself. It would be like me saying, oh, I could be a professional basketball player because I love basketball. No, I'm too damn short. So hopefully I know my limitations with regard to sports, and leaders know their limitations with regard to their own honest and integrity type virtues. Obviously, you had to be smart. You didn't necessarily have to be the smartest guy in the room. As a matter of fact, the intellectual geniuses maybe are a little bit too smart for their own good. They might be unrelatable with regard to other people being able to understand them and take their advice. So you might have the genius type folks working in the lab on a scientific experiment. Creativity. A lot of times in life we have problems that need solutions. We need to generate alternative solutions. And so if you think about coming to a leader, asking them for advice, you might have a problem and you want to hear their recommendation as to what you do to that problem. And so having that creativity ability is something that was very helpful. Confidence, self-efficacy, you want to have the trust that you can solve these problems and that you can not be flustered or stumped or stymied. And optimism. I think one thing about traits of leaders is that they are can-do kind of people. They think that problems are just opportunities to be solved, and they are sure that there is nothing that can't be accomplished if we put our mind to it. And so we don't need to have to just cross our fingers and wish for the best. We roll up our sleeves and we try to get it done. So when we move from the great man theory, where things were very kind of non-tangible, to the trait theory, where we actually begin to identify what people were leaders, we then moved on to the third era of leadership, which was what we call behavioral. This was actually how people actually acted, okay? You could be tall, but you could be selfish. You could have a thick head of hair, but you could be non-sympathetic or non-empathic. So what they realized, again, as leadership evolved, is that, and again, at this point, leadership and management were still pretty much similar, okay? Leaders were considered the best managers. We haven't really seen the divergence of leadership and management. But at the point of the behavioral theory, this became a time when we really cared about what people did. And if the great man theory was mystical and the trait theory was physical and psychological, the behavioral theory was somewhat sociological, okay? As the behavioral sciences continued to expand, okay, we started studying what were the behaviors of the best managers. What did they actually do? And of course, back in the trait theory, a lot of times you had autocratic type behaviors. You had dictators, you had kings, you had people who were the bosses, and then they had their servants, right? The servants of the king. There was the court jester, there was the food taster, there were all these people who were in service to the king. But that was not necessarily the best approach as people became more self-sufficient. If you look at the 20th century, you'll find that people had more access to information, right? Even before the internet, you had the Encyclopedia Britannicas, you had radio news stories, you had television news stories. So as people became less dependent upon their leaders for answers, they demanded that their leaders start treating them well, right? I mean, if you look at human resources, right? In the 1920s and 30s, the boss said, jump, you said, how high, right? And as time went on with unionization and education and information, people started saying, you know what? I want a job where I'm treated like a human being. I want to be respected. I want to be valued. I want to be appreciated. And so what you found is that people started following those leaders who were the most supportive, the most nurturing, the most tolerant, people who were patient, because we wanted to be respected and trusted for what we did. So a lot of studies happened in the 20th century, the 1900s, where people tested different types of behaviors. They would, being that management was a relatively new science, the first thing that the behavioral scientists did is they tried to test management behavior the way we tested things in the laboratory, right? The hard sciences preceded the soft sciences. So we wanted to take a lesson from chemistry or physics and say, let's do an experimental test. Let's have people work in low light conditions and see if they work better or worse than high light conditions. Let's have people work in cold buildings and see if they work as well as when they're warm. And what they found out is that didn't necessarily affect the work output as much as the relationships they had to their boss and to each other. And so there was a study done, a famous study done, which talked about the emphasis on accomplishing a task versus the consideration you had for their people. And they found that the worst kind of boss was one who only cared about getting the job done. They were task-oriented, and they really didn't care what that meant for the people. If they had to work 12 hours a day, if they had to work in uncomfortable conditions, if they got hurt on the job, none of those things mattered as long as we accomplished the task. Well, the problem with that is that people got tired of that. And the first chance they got, they quit those jobs, because I don't want to work for a guy who's a jerk. I don't want to work for a guy who's unreasonable, who's someone who just doesn't treat me like a valuable human being. And so that didn't work. On the other extreme, you had people, bosses, leaders, who were only interested in being liked, being well liked. This is sometimes called country club management, right? My boss loves me, I'm a player's coach. The problem is everyone loves me, but we're not getting the work done. We are so focused on making everyone happy and comfortable that we're not getting our task accomplished. And so that's an extreme that didn't work. You don't find many people like that. Those are more or less the boundaries of what one can do when trying to balance concern for people and concern for tasks. And so most people kind of balanced the compromise. They were like, oh, they weren't hated by their people, but they weren't loved by their person. They didn't maximize the productivity, but they did enough to keep their job. What they found out is that the best managers were people who had a maximum concern for task. They always accomplished the objective, and they had a maximum concern for people. They did that by respecting the people they work for. And so that became a behavior whereby only the best managers were able to balance their concern for people and concern for tasks. And once those leaders emerged, the word got around fast. Everyone wanted to work for that kind of leader. So they had the most followers and they had the most success. So little by little, teachers in business schools, in leadership schools, were trying to train people to behave that way, to balance concern for people and concern for tasks. And of course, that is harder. It's easier to do one or the other. And so what you found is few people were able to do that. Just like a professional baseball player, a lot of times you have hitters who can hit for power because they're swinging for the fences. They hit a lot of home runs, but they make a lot of outs. Then you have other people who hit for average, right? They make good contact. They spray the ball around the field. they get a high batting average, they get on base a lot, but they don't hit many home runs. They don't drive in many RBIs. But every once in a while, you'll get a superstar who will hit for power and hit for average. And that is, those are the guys who get the multi-million-dollar contracts, right? Well, likewise, those were the managers that became promoted, that became successful, that became well-known. And so that became a standard by which to teach management in business schools, right? A master's of business administration. As they developed courses, they learned the best practices, the best attributes of managers, and that's what they professed, okay? And most recently, the behavior has evolved to a more current state, which is sometimes referred to as servant leadership, okay? These are traits that has the leader actually in servitude to his subordinates. Now, I know that sounds kind of backwards, but it's become necessary because the subordinates have now been very well educated. They are very well experienced. The average worker has a lot of access to information. And also the average worker has a lot of choices, okay? They don't have to work for a guy they don't like. They don't have to work for a company they don't like. There are other jobs and there are other companies. And so if you don't treat people well, you lose the best people. And so the best leaders became those people who provided tremendous support to helping their subordinates accomplish all of their dreams. And the reason this is so important, it has to do with an environmental factor. Basically, what has happened in the 21st century is that the world is changing so fast, and the world has become so small that there's something called situational leadership. In other words, we can't know what we're going to do as far into the future as we used to. It used to be a manager would write up a 5-year plan, and we would stick to that plan, and we would be successful. That's what American companies did during the heyday of American industry, where we were making all the cars, and we were making all the electronics, and we were making all the machines. America had a plan, and we stuck to it, and it was kind of like, this is what it is, take it or leave it. There was a famous expression that said, what's good for General Motors is good for America. And for a long time, that worked. But what happened was, at one point, General Motors and American cars were big, heavy, fuel-inefficient cars that people couldn't afford to put the gas in. And so the Japanese started coming out with high-mileage cars, and Americans said, hey, gas has tripled in price. I can't afford to fill up my tank of a $5,000-pound land yacht that gets 9 miles to the gallon. I'm going to buy this Honda because it gets 20 miles to the gallon. And so basically, America was kind of asleep at the switch in recognizing what consumers wanted, okay? And that has pretty much paralleled in the political arena, and we can talk about that later. But the point is, in industry, the servant leaders were the ones that were helping their companies take advantage of the circumstances that were fast changing. And so being able to be flexible as a leader was critical. For example, there were some people that you needed to tell what to do. Okay, I'm a new employee. I've never been in this industry before. Tell me exactly what to do. So a leader had to be almost a teacher. A leader had to spell out what this person needed to do. You might have heard that expression, what do I have to do, draw you a map? Yes, you do, because this is my first day on the job, and I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, Can you be a teller? A lot of times people who are really smart are not the best teachers, you know. Michael Jordan knows how to play basketball, but he didn't know how to coach basketball. So sometimes being too smart or too talented or too capable for your own good does not make you a good teller. But as a leader, you have to be able to tell people that need it. Then there are other people that you have to sell. You have to explain to them why they need to do it. They might be smart enough to understand, but they might not understand why we're doing this. And so you might have to be a salesperson. You might have to convince them that they're capable of doing this, and this is why they should want to do it. Okay, so that's telling and now selling. So that requires, you know, two personalities within leadership, really, because there are plenty of people who are teachers who are not good salespeople. There are plenty of people who are good salespeople who are not teachers, right? Those who can't do teach, right? We've all heard that expression. Then there are other people that you need to facilitate. I need to get in there with you and work together on this. So we're having a focus group. We've got 4 or 5 people. I'm the leader. I'm in there. I've got to kind of stir the pot and make people come up with the ideas and do the problem solving. But I'm rolling up my sleeves and I'm in there with you. Again, we all know some people who don't like to get their hands dirty. They like to tell people what to do, but they don't like to get in there with them. And so here's the third dimension. Can I teach? Can I sell? Can I facilitate? Okay. And then the final thing is delegation. Okay. You might have some people who are very experienced, very capable, very knowledgeable, and you just have to let them go do their own thing. You delegate a task to them. You empower them to act in your place. Well, there are a lot of people who have trouble with that. You might know them as micromanagers. You might know them as control freaks. They have to do everything themselves, right? They're the people who say, if you want something done right, you got to do it yourself. Well, believe it or not, that's kind of an inferior approach to management. If you cannot delegate, you don't have one of the necessary skills to accomplish your tasks. Because a lot of times you can't do something by yourself. You don't have the time, or even, let's say, the ability to do something as well. But if you don't have the confidence and the security to let someone else do it for you, you have a blind spot. You have a weakness in your management style. So you can see how hard it is that one person would be able to tell, sell, facilitate, and delegate. But yet, those are the behaviors that became very much necessary for the best managers at the end of the 20th century in America. And so little by little, we were making more and more demands on our managers to, in fact, act as leaders. And of course, the same thing is true in politics. What's happened is parallels exist where originally we had the great man theory. You had a guy like Abraham Lincoln, or you had a guy like George Washington. You know, those were people that, founded this country, right? Our founding fathers, they're the great men. Well, then you had maybe guys like, Abraham Lincoln, again, he might fall under both categories, but he was tall and imposing and struck quite a figure. You had people like Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Riders. Then you had people like Franklin Roosevelt, maybe, who was a behaviorist, who basically said, hey, we've got this depression, we've got this world war, I'm going to lead my people out of that by, we only have fear, the only thing we have is fear itself. And so he acted certain behaviors. And then maybe people like Lyndon Johnson, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, maybe some of those characters started to reflect some of the servant leadership style where, I'm going to set an example. I'm going to be a role model for the qualities that I want you to embody. Patriotism, Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. You know, these are the kinds of things that have paralleled leadership in politics as well as business, okay? Well, thanks very much for watching. We hope you enjoyed the video. If you like what you heard, please give us a like. If you'd like to see more of these sessions, please subscribe.